often Iranian elections are a conundrum in this way that even though they're not free and fair, they're genuinely competitive. And, what's the sign of a competitive elections? I don't know who's going to be president on Friday.
This Friday, Iranians head back to the polls for a runoff election following a presidential contest on June 28th that saw historic low turnout and no clear winner. The sudden passing of President Ebrahim Raisi set off this chain of events, which now pits an archconservative and pro-reform candidate against each other.
The 2021 elections were the first uncompetitive elections since 1992, really. So Raisi was effectively handed the presidency.
With economic struggles, heavy sanctions, and regional tensions in Iran, what's exactly at stake in this snap election?
Forget, right? Most of the power in Iran is held by Ayatollah Khamenei, the supreme leader.
How will the outcome shape Iran's trajectory and impact regional stability?
Because Iran's anti-Israel policy doesn't only get it into trouble with the West, it also gets it into trouble with its Arab neighbors.
And what are the Iranian people really looking for in their next president? This is Global Insights by Network 2020. Today, we're joined by Dr. Arash Azizi, contributing writer to The Atlantic and the author of the 2024 book, What Iranians Want: Women, Life, and Freedom. Moderating the discussion is Courtney Doggart, president of Network 2020.
Starting in a place where we like to start, which is a little bit of groundwork. After their shocking sudden death of Iran's President Ebrahim Raisi, this election is taking place a year earlier than planned. So could you just start us off by letting us know, what do we know about this election, its process, and why it matters? What are some of the things that you're tracking?
Well, obviously this was an unexpected election. Raisi's death was a real shock. I would say that whenever a president like that dies in an aircraft like that, you will always have questions. It could have been just because the fleet of Iran is so bad, or it could have been foul play. At any rate, Raisi's death was a shock to the system. But one outcome could have been that, and so to give you a bit of a background, Ebrahim Raisi had been elected president in 2021. He had been there. He'd been an empty suit, really, for the whims of Ayatollah Khamenei, the supreme leader. He really was a man without much distinction or quality. It's a very quiet president. People would, you wouldn't even know he's there, basically. So he was this kind of figure, and was in some ways perfect for the supreme leader Khamenei, who has clashed with every single president before him who has served under him. So when he died, the question was, and this was an accidental. Raisi was elected in 2021 in the first really uncompetitive presidential election since the 1990s. So the Iranian elections are not free and fair, obviously. They're a contest within the very, very, very narrow confines of the Islamic Republic politicians. However, these politicians do have different bases and different tendencies. So they are often, Iranian elections are a conundrum in this way that even though they're not free and fair, they're genuinely competitive. The 2021 elections were the first uncompetitive elections since 1992, really. So Raisi was effectively handed the presidency. Now, when he died, the question was, obviously Khamenei and those who get to decide who gets to run in the elections had a choice. Would they try to basically hand it to someone, or will it be a genuinely competitive affair again? It ended up to be the latter. So this election is genuinely competitive. And what's the sign of a competitive elections? I don't know who's going to be president on Friday. Right? I mean, I have my guesses, but I don't know. And anyone who says otherwise, if someone says, well, it's not a competitive election, it's a very easy test. Ask them, please let us know, spare us all the work that we're doing to know who's going to be president on Friday. And 6 candidates have been allowed to run. Of this, the Iranian politics, the Iranian official politics of the Islamic Republic, generally speaking, goes to 3 camps, which we can call conservatives, reformists, and sort of centrists. And the centrists are really close to reformists. They are, and the conservatives, which include both conservatives and what we call hardliners or ultra hardliners, they want allegiance to the supreme leader Khamenei. very tough social repression, and generally speaking, in recent years, being close to Russia and China more, much more of an anti-West and anti-Israel policy. Generally, that's what they represent to different degrees. Reformists traditionally stood for democratization, and also for more West-facing policy, an agreement with the United States, an agreement over the nuclear program that would lead to the lifting of the sanctions, and generally a policy of better ties with the neighbors. Because Iran's anti-Israel policy doesn't only get it into trouble with the West, it also gets it into trouble with its Arab neighbors, countries in the region like Saudi Arabia and Egypt and Bahrain and Jordan, and none of whom really have great ties with Iran. And the centrists usually are basically they are reformists without the democratizing part. So the centrists are former conservatives, basically, who have sort of realized that the ways of the hardliners don't work, that held Iran back, destroyed our economy and everything. So they don't stand for democratization. They stand for what sometimes they call the Chinese model, actually, by which they mean economic modernization and sort of a better ties with the West without democracy. And when I say better ties with the West, they're thinking of China of a pre-Xi Jinping era, really. So that's what they would call the Chinese model. So anyway, so you have these three factions, and 4 conservatives were allowed to run, and 1 centrist and 1 reformist. And of these 3 candidates are serious, right? So 3 don't have any chance of winning. And the 3 serious one is there is Jalili, who is a hardliner. We can call him the fundamentalist to make it easier. There is Ghalibaf, the Speaker of the Parliament, who I believe to be the front runner. He's a conservative. I would call him the technocrat, though, because even though he's a conservative, he's very much in some ways a centrist technocrat. He's not an ideologue. He doesn't really care about, he, like many others, knows that the Islamic Revolution and its ideas are finished. There, no one believes in them. So he was very much a strong man with a base in the military militia in Iran, the IRGC that we can talk about. And third, last but not least, is Pezeshkian, the reformist candidate, the black horse, dark horse, I guess you call it in English, of this race, and very much a surprise candidate. Reformists have been really marginalized in Iranian politics for so many years that it wasn't expected for reformists to be allowed to run. But Pezeshkian was. And the interesting thing is that he hasn't really ran as a reformist because he's not really running on any democratizing agenda at all. He's very much a loyalist to the Khamenei. Every other sentence, he talks about how he's loyal to Khamenei. But he's very much running as a centrist in the tradition of President Rouhani. In fact, some of the key cabinet ministers of Rouhani, including Javad Zarif, who I think one of the guests spoke about knowing. So Javad Zarif is effectively running as a running mate with Pezeshkian. And a lot of polarization in this election is about, Rouhani versus his opponents, with Pezeshkian being basically a stand-in for Rouhani in some ways, and not really being a reformist, because, as I said, he's not really running on a reformist agenda. So these are the 3 candidates, as we can call them, the fundamentalist, the technocrat, and the reformist. And they're kind of neck by neck right now. So I think it's very likely that what happens on Friday is that none of them will get 50% of the vote, which means we go to a second round on July 8th. And last thing I'd say is that I didn't, and I give you a broad overview, so sorry if I presake some of the questions, but you can ask me further. The only other thing I would say is that of course, one big issue is that will Iranian people vote? I'm not planning to vote. I voted last time in 2017, and many Iranians are like that as well. 2021 was the first presidential election in which majority of Iranians didn't vote, and I think this time and it makes sense because it was uncompetitive elections, right? But I think this time, since the turnout will go, it's a genuinely competitive elections between these 3 people, it's very likely that it would go above 50% again. But the key question is how much? And basically, the more people vote, the more someone like Pezeshkian, who attracts the vote of people whose other option might be a boycott, can win. And the lowest, the lower the turnout goes, it would be probably better news for someone like Jalili the fundamentalists is his voting base are the hardline devotees of the regime, who will definitely turn out to vote. But for many others, they believe any vote would be legitimizing this Islamic Republic, that, of course, many of its policies people don't like, and of course has killed hundreds of Iranian citizens in the last few years during the protest movements. So, these are some of the main dynamics going to this election. But I'm happy to discuss further.
Great. Thank you very much for that helpful overview. You spoke about both the competitive and the uncompetitive nature of the sort of this bifurcated system. When it comes to the uncompetitive piece, I'd be curious if you could just talk us through what the selection of the approved candidates tells us about the current thinking or strategy of Iran's leadership, and how the population is generally reacting.
This is a very good question. So Supreme Leader Khamenei has been in power since 1989. I was 1 year old. So for someone like me, who's not that very young either anymore, this is a man who's ruled our country during my entire life. For people, my cousins, people younger, obviously it's the entire life and something, right? So he really looms large over the country in this way. And even according to the letter of the Constitution, the Supreme Leader already controls something like 70% of the power, let's say, if you want to quantify it. But he has gone much further. So he, with his hands all over the Iranian power system, basically, he now controls even much more than 70%. So the president is the second most powerful person in the country. But it's a very, very distant second. So that's something to remember. Now, how is it that why are we here? Basically, how does it work? How does Khamenei degrade the other centers of power in the country? I'll say two things. First of all, Khamenei has used a militia that is very important in Iran. It's called Islamic Revolutionary Guards Corps, IRGC. It's a very strange sort of creature in a way. You notice it's called IRGC. The I stands for Islamic. Do you notice the word missing? Iran, right? So it doesn't even have the name Iran in it. This is not an accident. From the very beginning, it was founded, as I know in my first book, I go into detail explaining this, but it was founded as sort of a political party / a militia, and has now come to control much of the Iranian economy, much of the Iranian politics, much of the Iranian foreign policy. For example, to give you an example, none of the embassies of Iran in the region, in Baghdad, in Beirut, are run by the foreign ministry of Iran. They're run by the IRGC effectively. The foreign minister can't even, the joke is, he can't even get a photocopy done if he was sort of in the neighborhood, right? It's the IRGC who runs them. And Khamenei very much has used the IRGC to expand his power in society. And also, so the way Islamic Republic is set up, the Islamic Republic setup owes more to Plato's Republic, than to the Quran or any Islamic text. It's very much a philosopher-king system in which Khamenei is this person who controls over everything. But then it has all these republican institutions like the presidency, the parliament. But the trick is that all elections in the Islamic Republic, any candidate who wants to run for anything, being a city council, be it a mayor, actually, which is usually picked by the city council, or the parliament, or of course the president, all the candidates have to be vetted with this body that is called the Guardian Council. And the Guardian Council consists of 12 people, 12 men, of course, like most institutions in Iran. Women, of course, were barred from running for president. As the Constitution says, it uses a term that's sort of unclear. Many women run every time they register a run, and they've always been denied. Speaking of the patriarchy, I should also remind you that Iran has had one female cabinet minister since 1979, and that was under Ahmadinejad, actually. So, that also tells you something about the system. But anyways, the Guardian Council is 12 men, all of whom are directly or indirectly appointed by Khamenei, and so they decide who gets to run.
At Network 2020, we believe in the power of collaboration to drive meaningful change. We bring together diverse perspectives and expertise to explore new ideas and approaches to global challenges. Join us to engage in thoughtful discussions, foster understanding, and contribute to a more informed and nuanced dialogue. Donate or become a member today. Learn more by clicking the link in the description.
Now, to answer the second part of your question as to, what does the scene that was set tell us? I think it tells us something. And Khamenei is a dictator and a brutal dictator, but he's sure an interesting guy. He's not a predictable guy. That's why we're kind of having this meeting even, and that's why, why I spend hours reading about it and writing about it. So, Khamenei could have, as I said, like limited the, he could have handed it to whoever he wanted. And, he really had the space to do that, but he decided to broaden the base. I think he wants the electoral turnout to go up, to go north of 50%. I think he's very worried about that being low. And I think more importantly, he's not just after people as in the ordinary people like me, ordinary citizens of Iran participating, but he wants increased elite buy-in in the system. He understands that it's a dangerous thing where huge parts of the elite are just not part of the system anymore. And reformists are still part of the elite, right? And by elite, when I say elite, consider this very broadly. I mean university professors, I mean former diplomats, I mean, people who are the deputy head of the agricultural organization in a province, right? A lot of these people are sort of reformists. So when reformist politicians get to come to power or at least be part of the game or so be legitimated through this election, they feel more included. And it's not just a matter of feeling, they get more jobs, they get more budgets, so Khamenei has decreased his isolation effectively. And frankly, also gave a suck, there is a reason we haven't really talked about the Iranian opposition, the opponents of the regime, which are very unorganized, these brilliant feminist, labor activists, people like myself. I mean, that's obviously who I sort of support. I'm not calling myself brilliant, but I'm in awe of the brilliance of my brethren in Iran. These people don't really have a political leadership of any sort, political representation, this is during the Women and Life Freedom movement that really shook Iran in 2022 and 2023. Tens of thousands of people came out to the protest. So it was the nadir, the lowest point of the regime's legitimacy in many points. But they failed to put together, the movement failed to win any actual victories, right? Of course, hundreds were killed, as I said, by the police. So this is the repression. This is how it worked. But I think Khamenei now wants to use that moment to expand his base, the base of the regime a little bit, and get elite buy-in. And this is all in the other, okay, this is the last thing I'll say here is that the other big anticipation here that you have to all remember is that Khamenei is 85 years old. That means he's going to die at some point, right? He is not a very healthy man. He's had cancer before. He's lost his hand early on, in the 1980s after a bomb assassination attempt on him. He's not a very healthy man. He has a very stressful job, as you can imagine. So at some point he's going to die. And so the succession issue of who will succeed him is going to be very important. It really matters who's the president then. So that's also something that is on the minds of Iranians and is on the minds of, certainly on the minds of Khamenei as he sets the scene.
Right. Terrific. Thank you. Turning to what is on the minds of the Iranians, you put out a book recently about the future of Iranian politics called What Iranians Want. It was described by The Guardian as a document of real optimism. What do Iranians want, and is there a viable path to get there?
A great question. I think Iranians in the past few decades, Iranians have launched, and my book is really a story of all the civic movements, all the struggles, all the, feminist groups and labor strikes, environmental groups, religious minority fights, citizenship rights, and, hundreds of thousands, millions of Iranians have been involved in these struggles in the last couple of decades, really, that culminated in many ways in 2022, 2023. And unfortunately, we've gotten none of it. What do we want? We want democracy, gender justice, environmental justice, social justice, and they've gotten none of it. They live in a country that is poorer, more unequal, more authoritarian, more internationally isolated, more politically repressive. In every single way, it's worse than it was 20 years ago, right? So it's a very depressing state of affairs when you think about it. And what do I mean when I say what have Iranians done, right? So they've done civic movements, and when you say civic movements, the difference of the being a civic activist in, say, California and Iran is that in Iran, you're very likely, when you do that, means you go to jail, you get beaten up repeatedly, you get blacklisted for life, right? So we're talking about really courageous activity there that they've done throughout these years. And they voted in elections sometimes because these elections, as I said, are competitive. So they sometimes voted for reformist candidates who promised to carry out this agenda. And they've street protested, right? So they've had massive street protests in 2009, in 2017, in 2019, and finally in 2022, 23. And they haven't got there. Is there a viable path to get there? I believe what the movement wanted, let's say last year in Iran, was to overthrow this regime and to build a democratic order. And no, it doesn't have a viable path there because it has failed to build a political leadership and a political alternative. And unfortunately, it's been victim, especially in recent years, of really bad advice, if you will, of the idea that, you can do it by hashtags or that you don't need a leadership. I know I had it turned out to be a very lively debate in Aspen yesterday with my friend Masih Alinejad, who is an activist. And it's all about, put your hands up and say this, and the Iranian women are great, and but that doesn't actually get you to change a government. Ayatollah Khamenei has survived. When he was first in power, George Bush, the father, was the president of the U.S., and I believe Ishaq Shamir was the prime minister in Israel, two countries that have really butted head with this regime, and the regime has fought against them. And Khamenei has survived them all, right? And he hasn't survived them all. He's not a type of guy who packs his bags and goes easily. Obviously, this is not Ben Ali in Tunisia. This is not, as I say, I named you everything else that Iranians have done inside the elite and on the street to clash with Khamenei, and then it failed. So you're not going to be able to do it unless you have a organized political alternative. And unfortunately, we don't have that. And this is what I'll add. So we don't have that. So my book is a document of real optimism, but the Guardian reviewer was very kind. But it's optimism about the human spirit. It's not optimism that these guys in the book are about to win, because they're not, right? And I'm very clear about this. But I believe that Iran, I hate these terms, a bit gendered, I guess, but it's like a pregnant with changes, right? But I think Iran is about to have a lot of changes, because I believe after the death of Khamenei, there actually will be a lot of change. I believe the kind of figures that you see are running. If you notice, even in my presentation, you could see things like, when I say someone like Ghalibaf becomes president, I'm telling you, he's not an ideologue, he's a technocrat. Well, that's gonna mean important changes in policies. So I think there is change in agenda, but not democratization. I don't think any of these people are going to be like, oh, you know what we're going to do? Organize the only liberal democracy in the Middle East. That's also other context you have to remember, right? This is a region with effectively zero liberal democracies, with the exception of Israel. If we forget the occupation, Israel inside the green lines, I guess. But no, none of our Arab neighbors are democratic. Turkey is, of course, semi-democratic. My wife is from Turkey. I was like, she always complains about it not being free. I say my biggest dream in life would be if Iran was as democratic as Turkey. But so democratization is not on the agenda. But the people who have these demands will hopefully have they'll get a new lease on life, basically, to fight for a different. After the changes happen, they will have new opportunities to fight for certain things. And the last thing I'd say in this regard is that there's also a very interesting generational issue. In fact, in this election has really come up. The Gen Z, which was very much the hero of the 2022, 2023, thinks that people of the 80s, which is a slur in Iran now almost, and I'm born in the 80s, so I'm 88, so it's kind of the late bit of it when they attack the 80s. It's sort of like the anti-boomer sentiment within some millennials, I guess. The idea is that the 80s are these losers who do things like reading books, and they showed up and voted for these reformists, and they had hope that maybe a mullah with a slightly more liberal politics will change their life. So they think we're losers, basically, me and the people older than me think we're losers who put hopes in there. But at the same time, we, or a lot of people my generation, think, well, this is Gen Z, they don't know anything, they don't know our history, they don't know how to change things, and they kind of don't appreciate that, we fought the good fight in all these years. So there's a bit of a generational question as well, that obviously we're not going to be there forever. So it's a question of what will them, when they come of age, what kind of a civic movement will they lead, and what kind of struggles will they lead in the future.
Great, thank you. I'd like to get in a couple more questions before opening it up to the audience. Interestingly, you mentioned the conversation you're having with Masih. I'd be curious to get your thoughts within this activist community, what the take is on U.S. policy towards Iran, and whether or not a pre-JCPOA moment where there was a lot of hope for, potentially drawing closer in a way that would be effective, versus then the post-JCPOA Trump more hardline stance. And what's the take among Iranians that you speak with? Which one is more effective?
No, these are really excellent questions, Courtney. You're really good at this, because I have to say, because you sometimes get questions that are off, because these are really on questions. And in fact, this is what I debated. It ended up, Masih didn't tell me she's gonna take it there, but this is what we ended up debating. And I would say, one of the reasons the Iranian opposition and the activist crew website are so bitterly divided, especially in the diaspora, but also inside Iran. It's not like there's no division inside Iran, is on this question that they've advocated radically different things into U.S. policy. And this is, what policy should U.S. have? And how much does it matter what U.S. policy is, right? My first line actually is that what really matters is what we in Iranian opposition do, and what kind of policy we have, and the U.S. is secondary. And also, let's be honest, we can't control what the U.S. does, which is what people forget. It's not like, yes, the diplomats at the State Department meet me or Masih, and they're very grateful, and they're graceful, and they listen to us half an hour, but they're not going to decide on U.S. national security based on what a few of us accented Iranians are going to tell them. And I think this is something that people forget sometimes, right? Iranian Americans also don't have, even if we were united, they don't have anything like a serious political power in this country that they could change the policy there. But what do I think is so? I can tell you what I think, obviously, and I'm the, and I can tell you also what then someone like Masih thinks. So Masih and others, Masih has advocated a military strike on Iran by U.S. or Israel. She supports maximum pressure, I guess. Others draw the line. So others, for example, followers of Reza Pahlavi, former crown prince, and somewhat of an opposition figure, a very controversial opposition figure, whose supporters are also very bitterly attacking Masih. And then to just give you a bit of an idea of this scene, right? So, he draws the line. Pahlavi doesn't support a military attack on Iran, but they support maximum pressure and what they call maximum support, which basically means some sort of support to the Iranian opposition. So these are some of the differences. And so these groups of people are basically, they believe Iran policy under Trump was better, and they support these harsh policies toward the regime. I am of the opposite camp mostly, with the added, I would say perhaps I'm more middling in some ways, because I also have no illusions about, I think anybody who wants to be honest about U.S. policy on Iran would say that it's not an easy question, right? And I get dismayed in this country right now, everything is so polarized, and everyone, on Iran policy, anyone who pretends like, and I know if you ask serious Iran analyst people like Susan Maloney or people who are there, you will find out that they're not either saying Trump everything was terrible on Trump or everything was terrible under Biden, or they'll understand it's a very tough, or under Obama, it's a very tough question, involves many other things like Israel, like Lebanon, like Saudis, like the U.S. wanting to get out of the Middle East, right? So it's not a very easy question. But I would say that I don't believe the economic sanctions, I don't believe they've helped. They've destroyed the Iranian middle class. They made the average Iranian poorer. They've not weakened the regime. They manifestly have not weakened the regime. By that, it's still in power, right? Khamenei is a much more powerful figure today than he was, when the sanctions started increasing. under Ahmadinejad. His rule is much more stronger, and it destroyed the sort of west-facing part of the Iranian regime. It destroyed their political capital. And mind you, when I say west-facing, I want to be very clear about something. I'm not saying these guys are liberals or Democrats or like Western Valley. That's not what I mean. That's not the debate in the Iranian regime elite, right? There is the ones who are liberal Democrats were already crushed in 2009, basically, right? But the remaining debate is between those who say, look, Iran needs to have better relations with the US. It needs to get over this obsession of wanting to destroy Israel for its own interest, because they understand it's a very dangerous corner that Iran has picked to continue, right? And it's these people who are the centrists like Rouhani, they were weakened by these maximum pressure policies of President Trump. So speaking of prejudice, so I think JCPOA was a great achievement in 2015. I thought it gave power to the centrists in Iran. It would have. I'm very pleased to hear so many people here had visited Iran, right? I wish there would be hundreds and thousands more Americans visiting Iran. I believe that would have obviously been a good thing, ultimately. But unfortunately, the kind of policies that Trump initiated didn't help Rouhani, weakened really that wing of the regime. And the other thing that I should remind us all, of course, and 2015, 2016 Iran had a double-digit growth in 2016, in that sweet period after the nuclear deal before Trump was elected, a double-digit growth, 12.5. It had basically negative growth in years since, in many years. And so, the double-digit growth also gave legitimacy to Rouhani and them and those who advocated for better ties with the U.S. It was a very incredibly hopeful moment. I sometimes get angry because people, as a historian, I hate it and people just forget things, right? So everyone has forgotten about this era. But, you don't need to take my word for it. Go read newspaper headlines then. I mean, there were new hotels opening up in Iran. There are people from everywhere going to Iran wanting to do business. And it doesn't it's not rocket science to understand if you're IRGC, if you're a hardliner, it's not good news for you when there's more Western capital coming to Iran, more Western expertise coming to Iran, which is why they tried, very much to oppose this. And under the Trump administration, they had a better time in many ways. I guess the last thing I'd say there, in 2016, under the terms of the Iranian nuclear deal, the Iranian nuclear enrichment went down 3.67%. Remember this number, less than 4%. Today, Iran is a week away from a nuclear bomb. It's a week away, right? In fact, some suggest that it might already have the capacity, right? I mean, I don't think that's true, but some post about it. And that is thanks to the policy that President Trump followed, the leaving of the Iranian nuclear deal. And what it ensued. So Andy, and to sum up, to the activist community, as I said, it's not really united on this issue. It stands from anywhere between what I said to what Masih and others were there. And, I think I explained to you some of the general positions that exist there. But I want to emphasize again that this is really there's no US president, for example, that could be in power and not try to hit forces of the Islamic Republic at any point, right? Because Iran supports tons of militias in the region who are fighting the American forces all the time, who are firing at them here and there. So anybody who tells you otherwise is just dishonest, right? Anybody who says, I'll come and I'll stop hitting unless they want to just get hit and not do anything in return, which is, obviously not a viable policy. And so I think any honest policy would say that you would need a mix of, my friend Karim Sajjadpour, I think has one of the best ways of articulating this, that you need both more pressure and on the regime, but also a serious negotiation with them.
Excellent. Okay. I'll try to get in one more question, and that's one that I think is probably on the minds of some people who are here, and that's regional involvement. Obviously, you were just mentioning that Iran plays a role in supporting non-state actors in the region, like Hezbollah. Could you give some background on that dynamic and how, if at all, the election might impact it?
The election doesn't immediately impact it, right? Because don't forget, right? Most of the power in Iran is held by Ayatollah Khamenei, the supreme leader, who's obviously not on the ballot. In the more long-term way, it can impact it because, as I said, who wins the presidency will determine a bit about who is going to be in power later on. But so what's the situation? The situation is that for many years, the Islamic Republic has made opposition to Israel, and not just opposition, a will to destroy Israel, a open declaration that we want to destroy Israel, central to its identity. And it's again something that we sometimes forget. The Arab states on the state level stopped fighting Israel long ago. The last Arab leader who had lobbed missiles at Israel was Saddam Hussein. He was taken down in 2003. So this unfortunate distinction now falls on the Islamic Republic. Iran is the only state in the world that fights Israel. It's a very important thing to remember. Not a single Arab state has fired a single shot against Israel for decades, right? Not Syria's Assad, despite all its long wars. Not Algeria, not any of the GCC countries. Nor do they give any support to the Palestinian militias. Yes, Qatar and Turkey have supported Hamas at points, but they basically do so in coordination with the US and Israel. They have not given Hamas arms or tell it how to attack. But Iran has done. Iran is the sole source of these anti-Israel militias in the region, the Iranian regime. And it doesn't matter whatever, this is stuff that always makes me going, right? Like, we should always start with facts, right? You want to be pro or anti everything you want, but you have to be pro facts first. These are facts, right? This is the fact that this is the Islamic Republic's policy. And Khamenei is very serious about it. And he's serious about it because he's a revolutionary ideologue. He's a serious revolutionary. People don't become revolutionaries to just change it when they get into the old age necessarily, right? This guy has dedicated his entire life to this. If he wanted to soften up or change, he had multiple opportunities. He has. In his 85, he's not about to change. This is the policy that he supports. But he's also, of course, not suicidal, and it's pretty smart, obviously. You don't get to keep this job if you're not smart. So what does this being a smartest mean? It means he's very tactical. He's very strategical for his own goals. And for years, what he's done successfully, he's avoided a direct confrontation with Israel, the US, that would have him destroyed, but building up, surrounding Israel with Hezbollah in the north and Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad in the south, and Houthis now on the other side, right? And he's very, unlike the American presidents, he is not bound to a 4-year period, so he's very patiently built a policy, and I think this should also lead to some retrospection, frankly, in the United States as to what are the effect of these long-term policies, that have changed so much in so many years. At any rate, so that's Khamenei for you, and yeah. So what's the situation there? So if I boil it down to the very question that I'm sure is on everybody's mind or a lot of people's mind, will there be a war with Israel or Lebanon in the next 24 hours or before we finish this call? I mean, it's a possibility, but I don't think Khamenei wants that. I also believe that personally he's a bit of a coward, actually. So, he's not one who wants to get into these direct confrontations. He prefers to bide his time. And by this time, he's the end of his life now. So he's not going to see that big grand battle with Israel. So it's very easy to plan for he can go to sleep, or he can go to his death hoping that, I prepared some nice armies, and the next generation will destroy Israel. But he doesn't have to actually do it. So I think he doesn't want a confrontation. He doesn't want a direct confrontation with Israel. Of course, it might happen still. But the last thing I say in this regard, in regards to presidential election, someone like Ghalibaf, for example, and these which I think these are dominant in Iranian elite, they don't want that. I think ultimately they don't share the anti-Israel animus in this ideological way that, we need to go and destroy this other country that also happens to be nuclear armed and have the support of the world's biggest superpower, right? The way they look at it, this is kind of an insane policy to have. It only works if you're a revolutionary ideologue. So I think for them, and this is me being a little bit of an optimist, but because I think this is the sort of future, I think these military technocrats, these guys, they want Iran to be a good old corrupt, military dictatorship, like Pakistan or like Algeria, which means what? Which means that they're probably going to lessen the social repression. They want to not go fight their own people every day, and that they're going to get over this obsession to destroy Israel, and just want to reach some sort of a modus vivendi with the US, number one. And if you reach it with the US, that's the main issue, right? Because if you if you have good ties with the US, that sort of Israel will come with it, basically. You can't have a country that has diplomatic ties with the US and also wants to destroy Israel, right? So, I mean, I think that's if the optimist in me believes that, well, these guys won't democratize, that's the direction we might see after Khamenei's death. But it will be a rocky ride to get there, for sure.
All right. On that note, thank you very much, Arash.
Thank you for joining us on this episode of Global Insights. Voiceover host and editor for this episode is Casey Craig, with production support from Liam Austin and Brian Thong. You can subscribe to Global Insights on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your audio. For more analysis, events, and ways to connect with our community, click on the link in the description. See you next time.